The hospital was always busy in the early hours, but that morning felt heavier than usual. The halls were filled with quiet footsteps, the soft rolling of equipment, and low voices that carried a mix of focus and fatigue. People moved quickly, each one already thinking about the long shift ahead. Among them walked a young woman no one really noticed. She had arrived just a few days earlier, hired as temporary staff to help during a busy period. Her file was simple, almost too simple. No long list of achievements, no special remarks. Just the basics. Enough to let her in, but not enough to make anyone curious. She kept her head slightly down as she walked, her steps calm and steady. There was nothing loud or attention-seeking about her. Even the way she dressed followed the same pattern, neat, clean, but unremarkable. If someone passed her in the hallway, they would probably forget her face moments later. At the nurse's station, a few staff members were already gathered, sipping coffee and going over notes. One of them glanced up briefly as she approached. "You're the new one, right?" the nurse asked, her tone neutral. The young woman nodded gently. "Yes, I was asked to assist in the morning rounds." The nurse handed her a clipboard without much thought. "Just follow along for now. It's a busy day." She accepted it with a quiet, "Thank you," and stepped aside, scanning the notes carefully. Her eyes moved quickly, but her expression didn't change. She didn't ask questions. She didn't interrupt. She simply observed. As the rounds began, she stayed slightly behind the group. Doctors discussed cases in short, efficient sentences. Nurses updated charts and prepared medications. It was a rhythm that everyone there understood well. She watched everything. The way a senior nurse adjusted a patient's position without waking them. The way a doctor checked a chart while already thinking about the next step. The way small details were handled without words. No one noticed how closely she paid attention. For most of the morning, nothing unusual happened. It was routine work, checking vitals, updating records, assisting where needed. She followed instructions carefully, never making a mistake, but never standing out either. That was how she preferred it. During a short break, two nurses stood near the window, talking quietly. "She's very quiet," one of them said, glancing toward the young woman who was organizing supplies nearby. "Yeah," the other replied. "Temporary staff usually try to impress. She doesn't even try. Maybe she's just nervous." "Maybe," the second nurse shrugged, though her tone carried a hint of doubt. Across the room, the young woman continued her task as if she hadn't heard anything. Her movements were smooth, almost effortless. Every item was placed exactly where it should be, no wasted motion. Still, no one thought much of it. Later that morning, a small situation came up in one of the treatment rooms. It wasn't serious, but it required careful handling. A patient needed a minor procedure, something simple but delicate enough that it couldn't be rushed. A junior doctor stood by the bedside, preparing to begin. A nurse assisted, handing over instruments and checking the setup. The young woman was nearby, sorting through a tray of supplies. She wasn't part of the team handling the procedure. At least not officially. "Can you pass me that?" the doctor asked, reaching for an instrument without looking. The nurse hesitated for a second, searching for it. Before she could find it, the young woman stepped forward quietly and handed it over. The doctor took it without thinking. "Thanks." She didn't say anything. She simply stepped back again. The procedure began. At first, everything seemed normal. The doctor worked carefully, but there was a slight hesitation in his movements. It was the kind of hesitation that came from inexperience, though he tried to hide it. The nurse noticed it too, her hands moving a little faster to keep up. For a moment, the room felt slightly tense. Then something small went off rhythm. It wasn't a mistake, not exactly. Just a moment where things didn't align as smoothly as they should have. The kind of moment that made everyone pause, even if only for a second. The doctor adjusted his position, trying to correct it. That was when the young woman stepped forward again. She didn't speak loudly or draw attention. She simply leaned in slightly and said, in a calm, steady voice, "May I?" The doctor looked up, surprised. For a brief second, he seemed unsure. But there was something in her tone, quiet confidence without pressure, that made him pause. "Okay," he said, stepping slightly aside. The nurse glanced between them, uncertain, but didn't stop her. The young woman moved into position. Her hands were steady. There was no rush, no hesitation. She picked up the instrument and adjusted it with a level of precision that immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. It was subtle at first. The angle of her hand, the way she aligned everything without needing to check twice, the smoothness of each movement. The tension in the room began to fade. The nurse, who had been watching closely, felt her shoulders relax without realizing it. The doctor stood still, observing. The young woman completed the adjustment quickly, but not carelessly. Every step was controlled, deliberate. Within moments, the small disruption was gone. The procedure continued, now flowing smoothly again. She stepped back as quietly as she had stepped in. "There," she said softly. For a second, no one spoke. The doctor blinked, then looked down at the work. Everything was exactly as it should be. "Right," he said almost to himself and continued. The rest of the procedure went without any issues. When it was over, the nurse began cleaning up, her movements slower than before. She glanced at the young woman, who had already returned to organizing the tray as if nothing had happened. "That was—" the nurse started, then stopped. The young woman looked up, waiting. "Thank you," the nurse finished, her voice quieter than usual. The young woman gave a small nod. "Of course." She didn't smile. She didn't explain. She just went back to her task. Later, outside the room, the doctor leaned against the wall for a moment. "Did you see that?" he asked the nurse. The nurse nodded. "Yeah. She handled that like—" he trailed off, unable to find the right words. "Like she's done it 100 times, the nurse said softly. They both looked back toward the room. Inside, the young woman was already gone. By the afternoon, the moment had started to fade into the background, replaced by new tasks and responsibilities. But something had changed, even if no one said it out loud. A few nurses exchanged looks when she passed by. Not obvious looks, just small, quiet glances. Curiosity had started to grow. Who was she, really? The young woman, however, remained the same. She moved through the halls with the same calm presence. She followed instructions, completed her tasks, and stayed out of unnecessary conversations. If she noticed the subtle shift in how people looked at her, she didn't show it. As the day slowly came to an end, the hospital began to quiet down. The rush of the morning had passed, leaving behind a softer, slower rhythm. At the nurse's station, someone mentioned the earlier moment again. "That new girl," one nurse said, lowering her voice slightly. "Did you see what she did?" Another nodded. "Yeah, that wasn't normal. Do you think she has experience somewhere else?" "Maybe. But then why is she here like this?" No one had an answer. Across the room, the young woman stood by the window, looking out for a brief moment. The light outside had started to fade, casting a warm glow over the buildings in the distance. She didn't stay there long. There was still work to do. As she turned away, her expression remained calm, unchanged. But for the first time, a few people were starting to notice her. And somewhere deep in the quiet corners of the hospital, a simple question had begun to take shape. Not spoken loudly, not yet, but it was there. And it was only the beginning. The next morning, the hospital felt almost the same as always, but something small had shifted. It wasn't something anyone could point to directly. It was quieter than that, hidden in the way people looked at each other, in the pauses between conversations. The young woman arrived on time, just as she had the day before. Her steps were steady, her expression calm. She walked past the front desk, greeted by a few polite nods this time instead of being completely overlooked. It was a small change, but it was there. At the nurse's station, a few staff members were already discussing patient updates. Their voices lowered slightly when she approached, not out of secrecy, but out of curiosity that hadn't yet found the right words. "You're early," one nurse said, offering a brief smile. "I like to be prepared," the young woman replied gently. She picked up her clipboard and began reviewing the day's schedule. Her eyes moved quickly across the notes, taking in details most people would skim past. She didn't ask questions, but her focus made it clear she understood more than she showed. As the morning rounds began, she followed the group again, just as before. But this time, she wasn't entirely in the background. A senior nurse, someone known for being observant, slowed her pace slightly to walk beside her. "You handled things well yesterday," she said quietly. The young woman glanced at her, then gave a small nod. It was just a small adjustment. The nurse studied her for a moment. Not everyone can make that kind of adjustment so quickly. The young woman didn't respond right away. She looked ahead, watching the doctors move from one room to another. "I've seen similar situations before," she said finally, her voice calm. The answer was simple, but it left more questions than it resolved. The nurse didn't press further, but her curiosity deepened. As they entered the next room, the usual routine continued. Patients were checked, notes were updated, and instructions were given. The young woman assisted where needed, her movements quiet and precise. But now people were watching. Not openly, not in a way that would make her uncomfortable, but enough to notice the details. The way she prepared equipment before being asked. The way she seemed to anticipate what would be needed next. The way her hands never hesitated, even during small tasks. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't showy. It was simply steady. Later in the morning, a small situation came up again. A patient needed assistance with a routine procedure, something that usually went smoothly but required attention to detail. A junior staff member began setting things up, but there was a slight uncertainty in their movements. It was subtle but noticeable to anyone paying close attention. The young woman stood nearby organizing supplies. She didn't step in immediately. She watched for a moment, giving space. Then, in a soft voice, she said, "You might want to adjust that angle slightly." The staff member looked up, surprised. "Like this. Just a little more," she said, stepping closer but not taking over. The adjustment was made. Immediately the setup looked better, more stable, more aligned. "Oh," the staff member said, a hint of relief in their voice. "That makes sense." The young woman gave a small nod. "It helps avoid unnecessary strain." She stepped back again, letting them continue. This time she didn't need to take over. Her guidance had been enough. From across the room, another nurse had been watching. "She didn't even touch it," the nurse whispered to a colleague. "She just knew." The colleague nodded slowly. "Yeah. That's not something you pick up overnight." As the day went on, moments like that began to repeat. Small corrections, quiet suggestions, subtle improvements. Each one on its own was easy to overlook. But together, they painted a picture that was becoming harder to ignore. During a short break, a group of nurses gathered near the back hallway, their voices low but filled with curiosity. "Where do you think she worked before?" one of them asked. "No idea," another replied. "But it has to be somewhere intense. Why would someone like that come here as temporary staff?" The question hung in the air. No one had an answer. Across the hall, the young woman sat alone for a moment, her hands resting quietly in her lap. She wasn't on her phone. She wasn't trying to join any conversations. She simply sat, as if gathering her thoughts. A staff member approached her cautiously. "Can I ask you something?" they said. She looked up, her expression open but calm. "Of course. Where did you learn all this?" the staff member asked, gesturing slightly, as if referring to everything she had done. The young woman paused for a brief second. "Different places," she said. The answer was vague, but not dismissive. "Different places?" the staff member repeated, clearly hoping for more. She gave a small, almost apologetic smile. "I've moved around a lot." That was all she offered. The staff member nodded, though it was clear they weren't fully satisfied. Still, something about her tone made it hard to push further. Later that afternoon, the hospital grew busier again. New patients arrived, and the pace picked up. The calm moments of the morning faded into a steady rhythm of activity. In one of the rooms, a situation began to develop that required quick attention. It wasn't serious, but it needed to be handled properly to avoid complications. A small team gathered, working through the steps. The young woman stood just outside the immediate circle, observing. One of the nurses hesitated briefly, unsure about the next step. Before anyone else could respond, the young woman spoke, her voice calm but clear. "If you stabilize that first, it'll be easier to proceed." The nurse looked at her, then at the setup, then back again. "Right," the nurse said, adjusting their approach. The difference was immediate. The process became smoother, more controlled. This time, no one questioned her. No one asked if she was sure. They simply listened. From the corner of the room, a senior staff member watched the entire exchange. There was no doubt in their expression now. Only curiosity. After the situation was handled, the team began to disperse. The young woman turned to leave, but the senior staff member stepped forward. "You seem to know exactly what you're doing," they said. The young woman stopped, meeting their gaze. "I try to be helpful," she replied. "That's more than just being helpful," the staff member said gently. "That's experience." She didn't respond immediately. For a brief moment, something flickered in her eyes. Not discomfort, not fear, just a quiet hesitation. "I've had some training," she said finally. "Where?" The question came softly, but directly. She looked down for a second, then back up. "It's not important," she said. The answer was calm, but it carried a sense of finality. The staff member studied her for a moment longer, then nodded. "All right," they said. "But if you're here, we're glad to have you." The young woman gave a small nod. "Thank you." As she walked away, the staff member remained still, watching her go. There was something unusual about her. Something that didn't fit the simple explanation of temporary staff. By the end of the day, the atmosphere around her had changed even more. People didn't just notice her now. They remembered her. They watched her a little longer when she worked. They listened more carefully when she spoke. Even the smallest suggestions she made carried weight. But with that attention came more questions. Who was she? Why was she here? And why did she seem to know so much yet say so little? As the evening settled in, the young woman finished her tasks and prepared to leave. She moved through the halls with the same quiet presence, unchanged by the growing attention. At the exit, she paused for a brief moment, adjusting her bag. Behind her, two nurses spoke in hushed tones. "She's not just experienced," one said. "There's something more." "Yeah," the other agreed. "You can feel it." The young woman stepped outside into the cool evening air. She didn't look back. Inside the hospital, the questions continued to grow. And somewhere, without anyone realizing it, those quiet questions were beginning to reach the ears of someone who wouldn't ignore them for long. The following morning, the hospital felt different in a way that could not be explained by routine alone. The same white corridors, the same steady footsteps, the same soft beeping of machines in distant rooms. All of it was familiar. Yet something had changed in the way people carried themselves. Whispers moved faster than before. Not loud, not obvious, but present in every corner where staff gathered for even a moment. The young woman who had once blended into the background was now impossible to fully ignore. She arrived as usual, calm and punctual. Her expression remained steady as she walked through the entrance. But this time, a few heads turned slightly as she passed. Some staff members pretended not to look at her, while others watched openly for just a second longer than necessary. At the nurse's station, conversation stopped briefly when she approached. Then, just as quickly, it resumed, though softer than before. "Good morning," she said politely. "Morning," one nurse replied, offering a small nod that carried a hint of curiosity now instead of indifference. She picked up her assigned tasks without hesitation and began reviewing the day's schedule. Her focus was the same as always, steady and quiet. But the atmosphere around her was no longer the same. People were observing her more carefully. Not in a hostile way, but in a searching way, as if trying to understand something they had not yet been told. During the morning rounds, she followed the team as usual. The senior doctors moved ahead discussing patient cases, while nurses kept pace, updating charts and adjusting plans. The young woman stayed slightly behind, but not as far back as before. It was subtle, but she was no longer invisible. A few times, when decisions were being made quickly, eyes briefly shifted toward her, as if someone was silently wondering whether she might have something to add. She never interrupted. She never pushed herself forward. But she also never looked uncertain. That alone made people more curious. In one of the rooms, a routine check was underway when a small complication came up. It was not serious, but it required quick judgment. The team paused for a moment, recalculating the next step. A junior doctor hesitated, looking at the chart again as if searching for reassurance. The young woman stood near the doorway, quietly observing. After a second, she spoke in a calm voice. "If you adjust the timing slightly, it will stabilize more smoothly." The room went quiet for a fraction of a second. The junior doctor looked up at her, surprised, as if unsure whether to accept input from someone outside the immediate chain of responsibility. One of the nurses glanced between them, waiting. The young woman did not move forward. She did not insist. She simply waited, her expression neutral, respectful. The senior doctor in the room raised an eyebrow slightly. "And you think that will help?" he asked, not unkindly, but clearly assessing her. "Yes," she replied simply. "It reduces unnecessary stress on the system." There was no arrogance in her tone, only certainty. The senior doctor studied her for a moment longer. Then slowly he nodded. "Try it," he said to the team. The adjustment was made. Within moments, the situation improved. It was subtle but noticeable. The tension that had been building in the room eased. The junior doctor exhaled quietly, relieved. The nurse gave a small, thoughtful look toward the young woman, as if seeing her in a slightly different light again. But the young woman had already stepped back. She returned to her quiet position, as if she had never spoken at all. However, this time people did not forget it so easily. As the team moved on, the senior doctor walked slowly, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. A nurse beside him finally spoke what others were thinking. "She keeps doing that," the nurse said. "Doing what?" the doctor asked. "Knowing things before we fully decide." The doctor did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced back briefly. She was walking behind them, focused on the next task, completely calm. "That's not luck," he said quietly after a moment. The nurse nodded. "No, it doesn't feel like luck." By midday, the curiosity had grown into something more structured. Staff were no longer just observing her in passing. They were remembering specific moments, comparing notes, quietly discussing what they had seen. She corrected the setup yesterday before anyone asked. She guided that procedure without even taking over. She seems to notice things early. Each story added weight to the same question. Who exactly was she? And how did she know so much without ever speaking about her background? In a quiet office near the administration wing, a senior staff member was reviewing internal notes. A few comments had been made about the temporary staff member's unusual performance. Nothing negative, just observations that had started to stand out. The senior staff member leaned back in their chair, reading through the reports again. "Consistently accurate suggestions," one note said. "Strong procedural awareness," said another. "Minimal communication but high effectiveness," another line read. It was not unusual for skilled people to pass through hospitals. But it was unusual for someone to remain so silent about their experience while displaying such consistent understanding. The senior staff member closed the file slowly. Something did not add up. Meanwhile, the young woman continued her day as if nothing had changed. She assisted where needed, organized supplies, and responded when spoken to. But now, every small action she took was noticed by someone. Even simple tasks carried attention. When she prepared equipment, someone watched. When she walked between rooms, someone followed her movement for a second longer than necessary. When she spoke, even briefly, people listened more carefully. She remained unaffected by it all. But beneath the surface, something quiet was beginning to form around her presence. Later in the afternoon, an unexpected situation required attention in one of the observation rooms. A patient's condition required close monitoring, and the team was called in quickly to assess and adjust. The room filled with controlled urgency. Monitors beeped steadily. Staff moved with focused speed. Instructions were exchanged in short, precise sentences. The young woman arrived shortly after the initial team. She stood near the side of the room, watching without interfering. A senior nurse adjusted a setting but paused halfway, unsure if it was the correct adjustment. The uncertainty was small, but in a critical environment, even small hesitation mattered. The young woman stepped forward slightly. "Lower it by a small margin," she said quietly. The nurse looked at her. For a brief second there was hesitation, not because she doubted the suggestion, but because it came from someone still labeled as temporary staff. The senior doctor, already occupied, glanced over. "What did she say?" he asked. "Adjust it slightly lower," the nurse replied. The doctor considered it quickly. "Do it." The change was made. The monitors stabilized more evenly almost immediately. A quiet shift moved through the room. No one spoke for a moment. The young woman stepped back again, returning to her position near the wall. But this time something was different. The senior doctor looked at her more directly. Not briefly, not casually, but with real focus. He had seen enough now to understand that this was not random. After the situation stabilized, the room began to clear. Staff slowly stepped out, exchanging short updates and instructions for follow-up care. The young woman remained behind for a moment, checking that everything was properly arranged. The senior doctor did not leave immediately. Instead, he walked toward her. The room was quieter now, the urgency gone, replaced by a calm after-storm atmosphere. "You've been helping more than expected," he said. She looked at him calmly. "I'm just assisting where I can." "That's not just assisting," he replied. She said nothing. The doctor studied her carefully now, not with suspicion, but with growing certainty that there was more beneath the surface. "You don't speak much about your background," he said. "It's not necessary," she replied softly. "For most people, maybe not," he said. "But for someone who keeps making correct calls like this, it becomes necessary." A pause settled between them. The young woman's expression remained unchanged, but there was a slight stillness in her posture. Not fear, not discomfort, something more controlled. "I prefer to focus on the work," she said. The doctor nodded slowly, as if accepting that answer for now, but not fully letting go of the question. "Fair enough," he said. "But people will keep asking." She gave a small, polite nod. "I understand." As she turned to leave, the doctor spoke again, softer this time. "You're being watched more closely now." She paused briefly, then replied, "I noticed." And with that she walked out. In the hallway, the noise of the hospital returned around her. But something had shifted in the way she moved through it. It was no longer just quiet observation from others. It was attention and growing curiosity. Behind her, the senior doctor stood still for a moment, watching the corridor where she had disappeared. Then, almost to himself, he spoke a thought that had been forming since the morning. "She doesn't just understand procedures." He paused. "She understands them too well." And somewhere deep inside the hospital system, her file, once simple and unremarkable, was about to be looked at again. By the next day, the atmosphere inside the hospital had changed again, but this time it was more noticeable. It was no longer just quiet curiosity or small glances. Now there was something closer to intent. People were not only watching the young woman, they were trying to understand her. Even those who had previously ignored her completely were now aware of her presence. It showed in the way conversations paused when she walked by, in the way charts were held a little tighter, and in the way eyes followed her for just a second too long. She arrived as she always did, calm and unhurried. The morning light fell softly through the glass doors as she entered, but there was no sense of drama around her. She simply stepped inside like any other day, unaware, or perhaps pretending not to notice, that things were no longer the same. At the nurse's station, 2 staff members were speaking in low voices. When she approached, they immediately straightened, their conversation stopping mid-sentence. "Good morning," she said politely. Morning, one of them replied, but this time their tone was different, more careful, more measured. She took her clipboard and began reviewing the day's schedule. But behind her, the nurses exchanged a quick look. It's getting more serious, one whispered after she moved away. I heard administration asked about her file, the other replied. That sentence hung in the air for a moment longer than it should have. Her file. It had started as a simple curiosity the day before. Now it had become something else entirely. Meanwhile, in a small office near the administrative wing, the senior staff member who had reviewed her earlier notes was now looking at her file again. But this time there was more attention involved. Another colleague sat beside them, also reading. This is all she submitted? The colleague asked. Yes, the senior staff member replied. It's too simple, the colleague said immediately. No detailed history, no prior hospital references, just basic information. The senior staff member nodded slowly. That's what makes it strange. They both sat in silence for a moment. In hospitals, people usually left a trail. Training records, certifications, previous positions, recommendations, something. But here, there was almost nothing. And yet, the colleague added, she keeps performing like someone with years of experience in high-level environments. The senior staff member closed the file gently. That's why we need clarity, they said. By mid-morning, the decision had been made quietly. No announcement, no public discussion. Just a quiet instruction passed through the internal system. Her file would be reviewed again, more carefully this time, and her background would be verified more thoroughly. Back in the wards, the young woman continued her work as usual. She assisted with preparation, checked equipment, and responded calmly when called. But now, there was a subtle shift in how people interacted with her. A nurse who once casually handed her tools now paused slightly before speaking. A junior doctor who used to give instructions without hesitation now added extra politeness to their tone. Even small things had changed. But she remained the same. Calm, focused, quiet. As the morning progressed, a new situation brought a group of staff together in one of the treatment rooms. A patient required careful adjustment of a procedure plan that had already been set earlier. Nothing critical, but enough to require coordination between multiple staff members. The room filled quickly with discussion. Opinions were shared. Adjustments were debated. Small disagreements formed and were resolved in real time. The young woman stood slightly aside, observing as she usually did. But this time, something different happened. A senior nurse, usually confident and decisive, hesitated while reviewing a detail on the chart. It was a small pause, but in a room full of focused professionals, it stood out. The young woman noticed immediately. Without stepping forward fully, she said quietly, "That section should be rechecked before proceeding." The room went silent for a fraction of a second. The senior nurse looked up. "Are you suggesting an error?" The young woman didn't react defensively. "Not an error. Just a detail that may affect the timing." The nurse frowned slightly, then looked back at the chart. Another staff member leaned in, checking again. The senior doctor in the room finally spoke. "Show me." The chart was passed over. He scanned it carefully. The silence in the room grew heavier. After a few seconds, he exhaled slowly. "She's right," he said simply. The adjustment was made immediately. The tension eased, but the atmosphere did not return to normal. Something had shifted again. Now, it was not just curiosity. It was recognition. Later that afternoon, the senior staff member from administration requested a private meeting with her. It was not presented as something urgent or alarming, but the tone made it clear that it was important. When she was informed, she did not show surprise. She simply nodded. "All right," she said calmly. She was escorted to a quiet office away from the main activity areas. The room was simple, with a desk, a few chairs, and a window overlooking part of the hospital courtyard. The senior staff member was already there, waiting. He gestured for her to sit. She did. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he placed her file on the desk between them. "I've reviewed your records," he said. She looked at the file, then back at him. "And?" she asked softly. He studied her carefully before answering. "There's very little here. I provided what was requested," she said. "That's the issue," he replied. "For someone with your level of awareness, your record is unusually limited." She remained quiet. He continued, "People don't usually reach your level of understanding without structured training, experience, or references." "I understand," she said simply. "But yours doesn't show any of that clearly," he added. A pause settled between them. Outside the window, the courtyard was quiet. A few staff members walked in the distance, unaware of the conversation happening inside. Finally, she spoke. "I didn't think it was necessary to include everything," she said. The senior staff member leaned forward slightly. "Why not?" Her gaze lowered for a moment. "I came here to work," she said. "Not to be questioned." The answer was calm, but it carried weight. Not anger, not defensiveness, just finality. The senior staff member studied her reaction carefully. He was experienced enough to recognize when someone was avoiding a topic, and when someone simply believed the topic did not need to be shared. "This is a hospital," he said gently. "People need to understand who they are working with." "I am doing my job," she replied. "Yes," he agreed. "And you are doing it very well. That's exactly why questions are increasing." Silence returned. For a moment, the young woman looked down at her hands. Her expression did not change, but there was something quieter in her posture now. Not weakness, just restraint. Then she spoke again. "I don't want attention," she said. The senior staff member nodded slowly. "That may no longer be your choice." The words hung in the air. She looked up at him, not startled, just aware, because she understood what that meant. Outside the office, life in the hospital continued as usual. But inside, something had already begun to shift. Her presence was no longer just noticed. It was being investigated. And not everyone was satisfied with silence. Later that evening, as she returned to her duties, she noticed subtle differences in how she was being treated. It was not direct confrontation. No one questioned her openly, but there were signs. A staff member who usually greeted her simply nodded without speaking. Another who once asked for help now hesitated before approaching. Even the air felt slightly different around her. She continued working without interruption. But now, the quiet distance between her and others had grown. At one point, she passed by a group of staff who were standing near a workstation. Their conversation stopped the moment she appeared. She walked past without looking at them. But after she passed, the conversation resumed in a lower tone. "She didn't say anything in the meeting," one voice said. "What meeting?" another asked. "With administration," came the reply. A pause. "So it's true then," someone said. "No one knows anything for sure," another voice answered. But the uncertainty was clear. By the time her shift was nearing its end, the senior staff member who had met her earlier stood in his office again, looking at the file once more. Something about it still didn't fit. Not because of what was there, but because of what was missing. And as he closed it again, he made a quiet decision. "This cannot stay unresolved," he said to himself. Outside, the hospital lights began to glow as evening settled in. And somewhere within its walls, the question about her was no longer just curiosity. It was becoming a concern. The next morning arrived with a strange kind of silence inside the hospital. It was still busy, still full of movement, still carrying the same rhythm of beeping monitors and hurried footsteps. But beneath all of that, there was something else now. Expectation. People were no longer just working around the young woman. They were waiting for her to do something that would explain everything, or something that would finally break the mystery. She entered the building as she always did, calm and composed, her expression unchanged. But this time, even the security staff at the entrance glanced at her a little longer than usual. It was subtle but present. The kind of attention that followed someone without them needing to be announced. Inside, the atmosphere had clearly shifted. Conversations paused as she walked by. A few staff members looked away quickly, as if they didn't want to be caught watching. Others looked directly, openly curious. At the nurse's station, A senior nurse handed her the clipboard with a slightly different tone than before. "You're assigned to assist in observation room 2 today," she said. The young woman nodded. "All right." No questions. No hesitation. But behind the nurse's calm expression, there was tension. Something was expected to happen today. Not officially announced, but widely felt. And that expectation had a reason. In the early hours of the morning, a situation had developed that required extra support. A patient's condition had become unstable in a way that was not fully predictable. The medical team was prepared, but there was still uncertainty about how it would progress. It was not declared as critical yet, but it was close enough to draw attention. And for the first time since she arrived, the hospital had quietly decided something important. They would observe her closely during this case. Not as a test, not officially, but as a moment where everything she had done so far would either make sense or raise even more questions. In the preparation room, the team gathered. The senior doctor stood at the center reviewing the plan. His expression was serious but controlled. The staff around him listened carefully. The young woman stood slightly apart, as always waiting for instructions. But this time, the senior doctor looked at her longer than usual before speaking. "You'll stay with the observation team," he said. She nodded. Understood. There was no additional conversation. But the meaning behind his words was clear. He wanted to see her reaction under pressure. As the team moved toward the observation room, the atmosphere tightened. Everyone knew the situation required attention. Even if it was not fully declared as critical, no one was treating it casually. Inside the room, monitors displayed constant readings. The patient was stable for the moment, but the staff knew how quickly that could change. The young woman stood near the side, her eyes scanning the equipment, the readings, the setup. She did not interfere. She did not speak, but she observed everything. A junior staff member adjusted a setting slightly, then hesitated, unsure if it was correct. The senior nurse noticed. "Double-check that," she said. The junior staff member nodded quickly and reviewed it again. Before anyone else could respond, the young woman spoke quietly. "It will remain unstable if that value stays as it is." The room went still for a moment. The junior staff member looked confused. "But the chart says..." The senior nurse raised a hand, stopping him from continuing. She turned to the young woman. "Are you certain?" The young woman met her gaze calmly. "Yes." No hesitation. No emotional pressure. Just certainty. The senior doctor, who had been reviewing another screen, turned slightly. "What did she say?" he asked. The senior nurse repeated it. There was a pause. The doctor stepped closer, checking the readings himself. For a few seconds he said nothing. Then he adjusted the plan slightly. "Make the change," he said. The adjustment was made. Almost immediately, a subtle improvement appeared on the monitor. Not dramatic, not sudden, but enough to confirm that the direction was correct. The room exhaled quietly without meaning to. A few staff members exchanged looks. The senior doctor didn't speak for a moment. His eyes stayed on the monitor, then shifted slowly toward the young woman. This was not the first time she had been right, but it was the first time it had happened under this level of pressure. And it was not a coincidence anymore. As the situation continued, the team remained alert. The young woman stayed in her position, calm as always. But now, every time she moved slightly or spoke a short sentence, it carried weight. Not because she demanded attention, but because she had earned it in silence. At one point, the senior nurse leaned slightly toward the doctor. "She keeps predicting the adjustments before we finalize them," she whispered. The doctor didn't respond immediately, because he had noticed it too. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. A few hours passed with steady monitoring. The situation remained under control, but it required constant attention. The young woman did not leave her position even once. She stayed focused, watching every change carefully. And then something happened that changed everything. A sudden shift appeared in the patient's readings. Not severe enough to cause immediate alarm, but enough to signal a developing complication. The room reacted instantly. "Check the system," the senior nurse said. Already doing it, someone replied quickly. The junior staff moved faster, checking equipment, reviewing settings. The tension increased. The senior doctor stepped forward. Prepare the adjustment protocol. But before anyone could fully respond, the young woman spoke again. Wait. The room paused. It was not loud, but it was firm enough to stop movement. All eyes turned toward her. She looked at the monitor, then at the setup, then at the chart. If you proceed with that adjustment, it will correct the reading temporarily, she said calmly. But it will cause instability in the next cycle. The senior doctor frowned slightly. What do you suggest instead? She stepped forward for the first time into the center of the room. Shift the sequence first, she said. Then adjust the value gradually, not all at once. A silence followed. It was not disagreement. It was evaluation. The doctor looked at the monitor again, then at her, then back at the data. He was deciding, and the entire room waited. Finally, he gave a short nod. Do it her way, he said. The room moved immediately. The adjustments were made carefully, step by step. Everyone watched the monitor closely, and slowly, the instability began to settle. Not instantly, but correctly. The tension in the room eased, replaced by a quiet realization that something had just been prevented. Something that could have gone wrong. The senior nurse exhaled slowly. That was close, she said softly. The junior staff member looked shaken. I didn't even see that coming. No one responded to that, because all eyes had already shifted to the young woman. The senior doctor stepped back slightly, as if recalibrating his understanding of everything he had seen so far. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "Step outside with me." She nodded. The room continued its work as they walked out into the hallway. Outside, the lighting was softer, quieter. The sound of machines felt distant here. The doctor stopped near the window. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he turned to her. "This isn't normal experience," he said directly. She didn't respond immediately. He continued, "You don't just understand procedures. You understand systems, timing, pressure response. That's not something you learn casually." She looked at him calmly. "I observe carefully," she said. "That's not enough," he replied. Silence again. Then he spoke more carefully. "We've reviewed your file again." Her expression did not change, but her posture became slightly stiller. The doctor noticed that immediately. "There are gaps," he said, "large ones, and your performance does not match what is written." She looked down briefly, then back up. "I already explained," she said softly. "I've worked in different places." "That explanation is no longer enough," he said. Pause followed. The hallway felt heavier now, even though nothing physically had changed. The doctor lowered his voice. "People are starting to think you may be hiding something." She looked at him directly. "I am not hiding anything," she said. The tone was calm, but final. The doctor studied her for a long moment, then said, "Then help us understand." She didn't answer immediately. For the first time, there was hesitation, not uncertainty about her ability, but about what to reveal. Finally, she spoke. "I don't want my past to interfere with my work here," she said. "It already is," he replied gently. That sentence stayed between them, because it was true. She looked away for a moment, toward the window. The hospital grounds were quiet outside. People walking, unaware of the tension inside. Then she said quietly, "I just wanted a place to work without questions." The doctor nodded slowly. "But that's not possible anymore," he said. She closed her eyes briefly, as if accepting something she had been avoiding. When she opened them again, her expression was steady once more. "I understand," she said. And with that, she turned slightly as if preparing to leave. But the doctor spoke again. "Today proved something," he said. She stopped. He continued, "You didn't just assist. You prevented a serious complication." A pause. Then softer, "That changes how we see you." She didn't respond, because she already knew. Inside the hospital, things would never return to how they were before. And as she walked back toward the room, every step she took carried the weight of a truth that was no longer hidden. Whatever her past was, it was now only a matter of time before it came to light.